Welcome back to the gutter, the Grindhouse gutter. This is where we let the professor smoke, pick whatever trip we're going to take down the gutter. He selects it every month, and last month we did God, I'm blanking. Oh, it was the New York Ripper from 1982,
Yep.
and at the end of that episode, you selected what we're watching today. So, what have you brought to the gutter this month?
Well, we're going back 10 years before the last movie in 1982 was when, like you said, New York Ripper came out. So we're going back to 1972, and we're also going back to one of the subgenres that we haven't done quite as much of here on Grindhouse Gutter, and that is exploitation, and more specifically, black exploitation, which this will be the first time we've done a black exploitation movie on Grindhouse Gutter. And so I figured might as well go for one of the bigger titles in that subgenre, and it's Superfly from 1972.
Now, I guess technically we kind of did a black exploitation movie then when we talked about Abby, but
I
remember
forgot.
that was kind of
That's,
half horror, half black exploitation. So either way, right?
you're right. That was I forgot that we had put that in there because it was around the time Exorcist came out, right? I believe.
Yeah, yeah. It was like we did it at the beginning of November last year, so it was right after The Exorcist Believer it came out.
Yeah. And that was the first time I'd seen that movie. That was a fun one.
The Exorcist Believer?
No,
Yeah.
no, no.
Um,
Abby
I
was,
almost had you. I almost had you.
he almost got me. I
Yeah.
say Abby's probably about at least 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times better than.
Oh yeah, yeah. Even as cheap and low budget as that was, yeah, that's way more fun than Exorcist Believer was. But anyways, that's enough about that. You can go back into the podcast archives if you want to listen to that. By the way, I failed to mention off the top. I'm Josh, and that's Professor Smoke. We are from the All American Spookshow podcast, which you can listen to every Monday at 6 p.m. East. They come out right here on the YouTube channel and wherever you get your favorite podcast. But back to the Superfly.
Is this now you've seen it before?
Oh yeah, yeah. I've seen it a couple of times, and I'm gonna maybe this is I don't know about controversial, but uh I, this isn't one of my favorites. Now I will say I love the soundtrack. I think the soundtrack makes this movie. Um, but I've been more of a fan of Shaft and a few other movies, comparable movies of the time. I think I have enjoyed more over the years than I ever have Superfly.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to disagree with you on that either because I think it's if this didn't have the Curtis Mayfield soundtrack, you lose probably more than half the experience of the movie
Yeah,
because it is a phenomenal soundtrack. We talked about this off air. You mentioned Shaft. Yeah, Shaft is I agree is it had a bigger budget and it had a better storyline maybe going behind it. It just had more involved things with the filmmaking of that one. It had first of all it had a bigger budget, so it could do a lot more. But it had a great soundtrack as well. Certainly, it had a great theme song. But I would argue, or not really argue, because I think you pretty much kind of agree with me on this, that the Superfly soundtrack by Curtis Mayfield is even heads and tails above the Shaft soundtrack. I think, at least overall, when you're talking about the full album, I think every track on the soundtrack album is great,
yeah,
and
yeah.
the
The
Shaft soundtrack is great too. But I can really only ever remember the main theme song, of course, and then there's a lot of incidental musical cues by Isaac Hayes too. Instrumental tracks for that, just like there are some instrumental tracks for this one as well. But yeah, you definitely remember the Shaft theme song. And then the other ones, I kind of have to. I'll just put the album on and listen to it and remember. Oh yeah, okay, I remember this track now or whatever. But the Mayfield one, I can listen to that and put it in any '70s playlist, and the
yeah, I
entire every
mean
song.
the underlying score of the movie, the main obviously the title track, Superfly, but you've also got the Pusher Man. I mean, like there's tons of good tracks on this soundtrack to make
Yeah,
it really helps make this movie.
and a bonus, Curtis Mayfield and his band are in the movie in that bar scene, the club scene, whatever. Freddy's Dead is the theme that's kind of playing whenever he's driving through the credits of credits of the movie are starting and all that, as well as various other points it plays. But there's the instrumental track which is used in the movie, and then there was a track that had vocals that was not used in the movie but was actually on the soundtrack album, and the vocals in that are great too. But I don't know why they didn't have the vocal version in the movie if they just he hadn't written the lyrics for it by the time the movie came out or what. But whatever the case, that Freddy's Dead song is a great one, and that's the main theme that's kind of like that plays throughout various points in the movie.
I mean, look, I'm not by saying what I said, I'm not knocking this movie at all. I mean, for a movie that you know that this one is actually preserved in the U.S. National Film Registry. in the Library of Congress. So anything that gets put there has some obvious historical significance, and I get why, and it probably deserves that recognition. This just has never been one of my favorite ones because to me it's kind of like a lot a lot of nothing kind of happens throughout the movie. Like there are moments, and then you get the payoff at the end, but really it's just about this dude trying to get out of the game, right? He's a drug
Yeah.
dealer. He's trying to get out of the game, and just when he's almost out, he gets pulled back in, and then he has to figure out a way to try to get out at the end, right? So I mean, like, but it takes an hour and a half to get there. Everything I just explained.
Yeah, he's like you said, he's trying to get out of being a pusher and just sort of into somewhat of a normal life, I guess. All along the way, you have people in the path. His partner, who doesn't want to, get out of the life. Uh, Other gangsters that he's involved with and whatnot, and then also the cops who are on the take. A lot of them, like crooked cops, who want to get their cut of what's going on or whatever. So they're also, they don't want him to quit either. So he's got all these people on against him, and it's basically him trying to push back against all that, and yeah, like you said, get out of the game. And no, I would agree too that it is not the highest shining example of the black exploitation genre. I think it's an important film, and as you mentioned too, the soundtrack. I mean, there's no denying how great the soundtrack is, and without it,
Yeah,
the movie definitely.
and I think that's the thing about this movie is that it has a high cool factor. Just the whole
Yeah, yeah,
thing, the aesthetic, the soundtrack, and everything. It all comes together. And it's a really cool movie, and I think that's
yeah,
why it is as significant years and years later, right?
yeah. And well, one of the things you mentioned is that it kind of feels like there's not a whole lot going on, and there's key scenes, and then there's a lot of stuff that seems like it's just not as much going on. And I think that's because when the script was only 46 pages long.
Yeah. Well, there you go.
So they had to, they were improvised by showing. That's why there's certain scenes of priests driving around New York in the pimp mobile. Which, by the way, that car, we got to talk about that for a minute. That the pimp mobile that he's driving around, and he's not a pimp necessarily in the movie. He's a pusher, but this is definitely a top notch pimp mobile, and it's a literal one too because the guy who owned that car, whose name he's credited in the movie, if you look at the end credits, he's just credited as the pimp, and his name is just two initials, KC. And he was the guy with the red fedora. If you watch the movie, those who've seen it, or if you go back and watch it after this or whatever, uh, he was the one in the club, couple of the different club scenes. And I don't know, I don't remember that he's named in those scenes, that they say his name or anything, but he was the one wearing the white suit and the red fedora. That pimp mobile was his car. He was an actual Harlem pimp. And one of the producers, I think, ran into him on the street in New York, like he was getting his shoes shined, and then this black Eldorado pulls up, and he sits down beside him, gets his shoes shined as well. So they're just kind of chatting. He's like, "That's a badass car. I mean, I think you should come by and show it to, I guess, his other associates with the movie or whatever, because they might want to put it in the film." And then so the guy's like, "Yeah, I'll do that." He goes, so I guess they brought it by, and they put it in the movie, and they also put him in the movie. It wasn't his idea to like, hey, here's my car, I'll let you use it if you put me in the movie. They wanted him to be in the movie because he had a certain charisma. If you watch the movie, I mean, because he was an actual pimp. So
I mean, that didn't surprise me for a movie that I can tell had a budget of less than $500,000. To have to probably make some handshake deals. I saw it described somewhere as, or labeled, I should say, as a neo noir. I never really thought about that with this one, but you can see the elements there.
yeah, because it's got that. It's it's got the sort of gritty street stuff like film noirs had, as well as cops on the take, kind of crooked cops thing, and with gangsters and stuff. And it has more of a, definitely does have more of a noir feel than I don't know, a typical New York gangster type flick.
Yeah, I think that's another calling card of a lot of these movies of the time period too. Is it was usually, at least in my recollection, a little bit more comedy and stuff added to these movies, and this one really doesn't have. I mean, there's a few things in there, but this one's really more serious.
Yeah, that's what, and that will get a little bit reflected in the Grindhouse score, because I mean, this movie is, even though it is low budget, is Grindhouse related in that it played in Grindhouses probably more than it played in regular theaters, although I'm sure it played in a decent amount of urban theaters. But it definitely doesn't have all those elements that go into certain Grindhouse movies, like you said, the comedic element, the overly violent element, the more exploitation. It didn't really have much exploitation at all in this movie. I mean, there's the drug elements, but that's not it wasn't really exploitation per se. It was just showing what's happening on the streets.
Yeah, I mean that was the subject of the movie is that this dude's a drug pusher. So yeah, you're absolutely going to see that.
The principal actors in the movie I thought did a really great job for what it was. For what they not having hardly any of them acted except Priest. He had been a Shakespearean actor before this movie.
Yeah, Ron O'Neal.
Yeah, so he was probably the only one that had. I mean, the other ones I'm sure had some experience, but he probably had the most experience, and it shows. I think he did a great job as Priest.
Yeah, and he passed away back in 2004, but he was in a lot of stuff, like, years
Red
after
Dawn.
that. Yeah. Red Dawn, The Final Countdown. There was another at least one, I think there was multiple sequels, right? But he was in Superfly TNT. I think there was another one or two that had a different guy, if I'm not
Yeah,
mistaken. But
Superfly TNT came out 1 year later, and that was the one that he was in. And then
yeah.
there was another one way later, like in the '90s.
Yeah, then I think there's been a remake or two, if I'm not
Yeah,
mistaken, right? Like one fairly recently, and there might have been another one or whatever. But yeah, there's no question what this movie was culturally and historically, uh, not just in like urban cinema, but just 70s cinema period. I mean, but I don't know, just for me, it's a fine movie, it's a well-made movie, it's a fine movie. It doesn't bring all the elements that I'm looking for in these type of movies. So like it's not for me, it's not quite as entertaining as some of those other ones because of those reasons. But that's my 2 cents. But we really come here for your 2 cents. So for Grindhouse Gutter, you give a Grindhouse Gutter rating, which is 0 through 10, and that's kind of like what makes it a good Grindhouse flick, all the grindhousiness of it, all the elements that you want to throw in there. And then you're going to give us we don't do star ratings here. We do a rating based on what type of movie it is. And for blaxploitation, which we kind of classify in our exploitation, we give out X's. So for your Grindhouse Gutter rating, what do you want to say and give for that?
well, yeah, like I was alluding to earlier, it doesn't, it takes itself very seriously. This movie does, and which is fine. But when it comes to it played in grindhouses and it played, I'm sure, in drive-ins and urban theaters all over the place. But when we're just distinctly talking about grindhouse elements, there's plenty of them out there that have more outrageousness to it. Like you said, that comedic element and just outrageous one-liners and dialogue and whatnot. This one was going for serious dialogue, so it wasn't, you don't get as much of that zany kind of crazy one-liners and dialogue that you get in some of the other ones.
Dolomite comes to mind.
Yeah, yes, definitely like Petey Wheatstraw. The part
Yeah,
one of the.
it's nothing like that.
But for the Grindhouse rating, I guess I'll go with a 6, I suppose. I mean, because we go up to 10 on the Grindhouse. It's got the gritty streets of New York, and mainly most of it takes place in Harlem. In 1971 or two, whatever, it's probably, I'm guessing, shot in 1970 or 71. So you get that element, you get that badass pimp mobile. I mean, that alone is just when it's on the screen, it's its own character.
The first part of the movie, you're kind of like, you know what, this dude's not necessarily, he's like an anti-hero at best. Like he he's not a savory character. And then you kind of get to know him a little bit, and then you can kind of sympathize with his position, and he's trying to get out of the game or whatever. But at first you're kind of like, you know what, like screw this dude, whatever happened to him.
True. Yeah. Yeah. They developed his character along and along to where you do come around more with, like you said, sympathizing with his situation and him trying to,
Yeah.
let himself and get out of it.
And as far as your final rating, as far your X's, how many X's do you want to give it?
I mean, I'm kind of in the same boat you are about this movie. It's done well, and it's done with great enthusiasm by everybody involved. Everybody was trying to make the best movie they could, and they did make a great movie. I think it's just, I mentioned that it was only a 46-page script, and some of the other, some of the scenes feel like they were stretched out because they were trying to reach that 90-minute runtime, but yeah, there's worse ways you could do it than riding around New York in 1972. That's cool to me.
Yeah.
I like those shots at that time period. Also, though, that Curtis Mayfield soundtrack is going to bump it back up. Like I said, if it didn't have that, if it just had a standard run-of-the-mill soundtrack, I would even go a little bit lower on this rating. But because of that,
I agree.
I can't go any lower than 3 stars on it. 3 X's, I'm rather.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not going to argue. I mean, I think it's fair. Uh, it's just those slow moments, like you said, they're just padding it out clearly, and it's very obvious that you're like, fuck, they're just trying to get to an hour 30 here any way they can. We've had too much cool for this month, so we're going to wrap it up there. We're going to put a pin in Superfly, and maybe one of these days it'll make it on Cult Corner on the podcast when we have a deeper dive and get everybody else's thoughts on it. But as far as next month here on the gutter, uh, I guess the question is whether you're going to drag us further into the gutter or pull us out and let us have a little bit of a breath before the next
Oh,
one.
I think we're gonna drown you in the gutter.
What are we
We're gonna
going?
hold it, in the gutter. But we're gonna stay within the realm of exploitation because I've been kind of lacking on the exploitation. I've been horror and kung fu and action and whatnot. So I mean, we need to bump the exploitations up a little bit, I think. And but we're gonna move on to a different subgenre, and this one we haven't done on the Grindhouse Gutter yet, or on the podcast, or anything from this subgenre. It's we're going to dive into the Nazi exploitation subgenre, and we're going to go with one of the big names in that, Ilsa, She-Wolf of the SS, with Diane Thorne as Ilsa.
Oh boy, here we go. Now I've heard this title, I've seen the poster, I've seen the trailers, but I've never watched the movie. So I'm interested to see where you're going to take us with this one.
Yeah, well, this I have seen the VHS copy from back in, I don't remember who put that out, but back in the late 80s or so, probably when I saw it. And I'm pretty sure it was cut. So I'm pretty sure it was somewhat cut. So I'm sure if the print we'll be watching should hopefully be uncut. And so that'll be the first time I'm seeing the uncut version of the movie as well. And I had a chance to see it on the big screen some years back and missed that, unfortunately.
So something a little different for all of us then next month. So you want to stick around here on the YouTube channel, go check out our other series like Video Vortex and Hammer Horror in Order. And of course, every Monday at 6 p.m. East, new episodes of the All American Spook Show podcast come out. So lots here to do on the channel. Stick around, like, subscribe, click the bell to be notified, all that jazz. And we appreciate you watching. So stick around.